What's going on, guys? It is pretty early in the morning here in Austin, Texas, and sitting out here with a cup of coffee, trying to figure out what I'm gonna do with my day. So, my daughter started preschool this morning, and basically I just got 8 hours a day back, and I think that the best thing for me to do right now is let's go play some poker. So, I've got some hands coming up for you from this past session, and yeah, let's just get into it and see how we do. All right, guys, let's jump into it. So in this first hand, we are sitting in the big blind, and we look down at 7-3 offsuit. We get 3 limpers, and it gets back to us, and we just go ahead and check, as there's really not much to do with this hand, and we go off to a flop of ace-3-9 rainbow. Action checks around, and we go off to a very interesting turn card. Turn is a 7. Okay, so the small blind checks, and we have to figure out what we can extract from this pot. Nobody's really expressed any interest, so there's really not much in the way of big bets that I'm probably going to get out of this. So I go ahead and lead out for $6. So the middle position and the small blind player both call. The river is a offsuit deuce. Small blind checks, and at this point, with 3 of us still left in the pot, there might be a chance that somebody's maybe holding a weak ace that we might be able to get some value from. So I go ahead and bet out for $20. Middle position goes ahead and folds, and the small blind sits back for a moment, hems and haws, and ultimately decides on a fold, and we go ahead and take down this first pot. Moving on to the next hand, the literal next deal. We're sitting in the small blind, and we look down at king 3 suited, both hearts. The hijack raises up to 15, and I go ahead and decide to make the call, and the under the gun player also calls. So we go off to a flop of king, queen, 6 with 2 clubs. I check, and action goes ahead and checks around. Turn is the 5 of clubs. Well, not exactly a great turn card for us. The club flush draw gets there. We're really only sitting with top pair, but we have absolutely no kicker at this point. So we go ahead and check, and action once again checks around. So as we go to the river, I'm thinking, okay, maybe I may be able to make a bet and steal this pot, but the river comes out the ace of diamonds. So I go ahead and check. Action checks around again. I go ahead and show down my king, and we win another small pot. Moving on to the next hand, we're sitting on the button, and we look down at king-queen offsuit. The cutoff raises to $10. We go ahead and call, and the small blind and the hijack also call. So 4 ways to a flop of 9-7-7, 2 clubs. Action goes ahead and checks to us, and on this board we should probably be doing some form of leading, but multi-way, I'm just not feeling super confident about it, so we go ahead and check. Turn is a 6 of clubs. Small blind checks, and the hijack bets for $50. Cutoff folds, and now we have a decision to make. We can either try and go take a stab at this board and represent maybe a straight or a flush. But honestly, a lot of the cards on this board are better for the player in the small blind than they are for me. So I decide that even though I'm in position, it's probably best for me to just get out of the way, and the small blind folds as well. Moving on to the next one. Strap in, guys. The $4 straddle is on, and we are sitting in middle position, and we look down at 2 red kings. Absolutely beautiful cards. We go ahead and raise it up to $20, and the button, the small blind, and the straddle all call. So we go off to a flop 4 ways of 4, 6, queen, 2 clubs, and a spade. The small blind checks and the straddle checks, and it gets back to me, and I go ahead and I decide to lead out for $50. The button calls, and the other players get out of the way. So we're moving on to a turn, which is the 9 of spades. At this point, since I'm out of position, I don't think I want to give him another free card since now there are 2 flush draws on the board and there's still some straight possibilities out there. So I go ahead and jam. And as soon as I do this, the button goes into the tank. He is hemming and hawing, and he tanks for probably a minute and a half to 2 minutes. As soon as I fade the snap call, I can definitely feel like I'm not up against a flush draw at this point. So now I'm just praying for him to give us a call. After a while, he flips over the queen and asks me if the queen is good. I just continue to stare at the board, not wanting to give away the strength of my hand. Ultimately, though, he decides that it's not a good enough price for him to call, and he goes ahead and folds his queen, and we take down a pretty nice pot. All right, guys, strap into this next one because we're sitting under the gun, and we look down at pocket kings again. I go ahead and I raise to $25 and the hijack and the small blind call, and we go off to a flop of 7, 8, 5, 2 clubs. Well, this looks kind of familiar. Since I'm out of position, I decide to go ahead and lead out for $40 and both the hijack and the small blind call. The turn is the 3 of diamonds, and at this point, there's a lot of straight cards on the board. There's still a flush draw out there, and I've only got an overpair, and there are still some folks that could be holding overcards that might have floated. So I really want to charge as many of those draws as I possibly can. So I go ahead and I jam all in. Hijack thinks about it for a little while and then folds, and then the small blind goes into the tank as well. Clearly, he's got some kind of draw, but it can't be super, super strong because ultimately he does end up folding, and we do take down the pot. All right, guys, moving on to this next one. We're sitting in the cutoff, and we go ahead and we look down at 2 black aces. We go ahead and raise it up to $20, and the low jack, the under the gun, and the button all call. Flop comes out 10, 9, 6 rainbow. Action checks over to me, and I go ahead and I lead out for $45. The button calls, the under the gun player calls, but then the low jack does something weird. The low jack goes ahead and jams all in. Well, that's a choice. I can't really figure out what he's going to be jamming here other than sets or straights, I guess. But we've got aces, and if he hit a straight or he hit a set, hats off to you, sir. Congratulations, you get my money. So we go ahead and rejam all in, and both the button and the under the gun player fold. I ask the low jack how many times he wants to run it. He says 1 time. I go, all right, well, I've got aces. And he turns over 9-6 offsuit for a flopped 2 pair. Wow. Well, if anyone tells you that the 1-2 streets are not active, they are definitely lying because the action is definitely here in this game. So I basically start reaching into my bag because I'm like, all right, well, there isn't really much I've got. He's got more outs. He covers most of my outs at this point, so I'm really looking for a 10 or running cards of some kind. But I don't have to worry about any of that. When the turn is the ace of diamonds, river comes at 10 to give us a full house, and we end up scooping the whole thing and doubling up. Moving on to the next hand, we are sitting on the button, and we look down at Queen Jack of Hearts. We go ahead and we raise it up to $10, and the big blind and middle position player both call. The flop comes out Queen 8-6, 2 clubs. And this is where things automatically go off the rails when the big blind leads out for $45. And then the middle position player calls. All right, well, those big blind leads aren't really a thing, especially for over pot. So I'm sitting here in the tank with top pair, decent kicker. There was no 3-betting pre-flop, so I'm not up against anything like ace queen. I guess king queen could have flatted my raise, and I'm behind that, or maybe he's on a flush draw. So I'm sitting here in the tank, but ultimately the lead from the big blind is really, really weird, and I'm pretty sure I'm ahead of that, but the middle position call is also kind of weird. So I just go ahead and I fold, and I get out of the way, and the turn is the 6 of diamonds. And the big blind continues to lead. He leads now for $100, and the middle position calls once again. So at this point, I can't figure out what I'm up against. And the river comes out the jack of clubs. And the big blind leads again for $55. Middle position thinks about it for a second and calls, and the big blind turns over 7-9 of clubs for a flop straight flush draw and getting there on the river. But then middle position flips over 8-6 of diamonds for a full house. So I guess I was behind the whole way, but that was definitely a wild hand. So let's move on to the next one. In this next hand, we're in middle position, and we look down at Jack 7 of hearts. We limp, and it limps around the table, so we go 5 ways to a flop of 8-6 deuce with 2 hearts. Cutoff bets $5, and we're the only ones that call and come along. Turn 3 of clubs. Cutoff bets $5. Again, pretty easy call. River is the 9 of diamonds. So he goes ahead and checks, we go ahead and check, and he flips over an 8 for 1 pair and goes ahead and takes down the pot. All right, in this next one, we're sitting in the big blind, and we look down at 10-7 offsuit. It limps around to us, and we go ahead and check, and the flop comes 10-8-3 rainbow. Middle position bets $5, the low jack calls, and I go ahead and just call with top pair. Turn 4 spades. Middle position now bets $10. Low jack calls, I also call. Still, we've got top pair. There's a decent chance we can be pretty good, and we have the chance to make some interesting, sneaky 2 pairs. River comes the king. Middle position bets $10. Low jack folds. And at this point, I mean, if he got there with a king, I guess he got there with a king. I probably played this hand super passively and could have done a little bit better. But I go ahead and call and show down my 10, and middle position also flips over a 10. So I flip over my 7, and unfortunately, he flips over a 9. So the kicker ends up playing, and we lose kind of a small one here. All right, guys, for this next one, we're sitting under the gun, and we look down at queen 10 of spades. We go ahead and limp, expecting to call some kind of a raise from a position later on in the table, but that doesn't happen. The cutoff, the button, the big blind, and the +1 player all limp in. So we go 5 ways to a limped pot where the flop comes king 8-6 with 2 spades and a heart. I check, and action checks around to the cutoff, who bets $15. Button calls, the big blind calls, and at this point, I've got a pretty decent draw, so I go ahead and call as well. Turn is the 2 of hearts, and I check, and action just goes ahead and checks around. River is the 7 of hearts. Now the cutoff leads out for $35, and the button then re-raises to $100. Well, we missed absolutely everything. Didn't get the flush draw, didn't get the straight draw, couldn't even make a pair. So we go ahead and just fold and lose this one and move on to the next one. Moving on to this next one, I'm starting to recognize a pattern here. Anytime I get a suited hand, the same color but other suit seems to be what falls out on the board, and this is still the case with this hand as well. So we're sitting on the button, and we look down at ace-7 of spades. The under the gun player raises to $12, and action gets back around to me. I call, and the big blind calls. The flop comes 5-6-6 with 2 spades. Not the best flop for our particular hand, although we do have some blockers to potential straight possibilities, but we have a flush draw on a paired board, which is never something you really want to see, but action ultimately checks around, and the turn comes the jack of clubs. The big blind checks, and then the undergun player bets $15. Well, in for a penny, in for a pound, we've got the nut flush draw, so we go ahead and call, and the big blind calls as well. The river comes out the 10 of clubs. The big blind now leads out for 30, and the under the gun player basically only min clicks it and raises to 50. Neither of these sizes are really things, but at the same time, I don't really have a hand to call down here, especially with the action having been bet all 3 streets, so I just go ahead and fold and we move on to the next. Moving on to the next hand, we are sitting in the cutoff, and we look down once again at 2 black aces. The straddle to $6 is on in this hand, and I go ahead and I raise it up to $20. The button and the straddle both call, and we head off to a flop of king, queen, 6, 2 hearts, and a diamond. Well, my streak of seeing the opposite color of the cards in my hand continues. I go ahead and I lead out for 50 here, and only the button calls. Turn comes the 7 of diamonds. I go ahead and check, and the button checks behind. The river is the queen of diamonds. Okay, so backdoor diamond draw gets there. Middle pair just turned trips. At this point, I'm not feeling super confident in my hand as played. So I go ahead and check, and then the button leads out for $125. Well, I'm trying to do a better job of not immediately assuming my opponents have it. So when he leads out for $125, I still have aces. Yes, the backdoor diamonds got there. Yes, the queen turned trips. But at the same time, ace-king is a hand that we're beating. King-jack is a hand that we're beating. We're beating a lot of busted front door heart draws. So I go ahead and I call, and the button says, you're good, and I flip over my aces, and we take down the pot. Moving on to the next hand, we are sitting in the small blind, and we look down at king-jack offsuit. The straddle is on to 6 once again, and the low-jack limps. I go ahead and I limp as well, and the straddle checks. So we go off to a flop of queen, 7, 8, 2 diamonds. Action checks around, and we head off to a turn, which comes pretty favorably for us. It's the king of diamonds. The low jack now leads out for $30. The straddler folds, and I decide to go ahead and make the call. The river comes a brick 9. I say brick just because, based on the actions taken in the hand, I don't expect a lot of straight draws to have gotten there on this one. So the low jack then leads out for 80. Again, I look at it from a standpoint of, if you've got something better than top pair, congratulations, here's my money, but I can't be folding top pair, especially in some of these really juicy games. So I go ahead and I call the $80, and we go ahead and take down the pot. All right, guys, this next one's going to be pretty wild. So we're sitting in the cutoff, and we look down at ace-5 suited clubs. The hijack straddled the $15, so I go ahead and I call, and the under the gun player calls, and the straddler just checks. So we go off to a flop of 2, 3, 8 with 2 clubs, the 2 of clubs and the 3 of clubs. So we flop a straight flush draw. The straddler goes ahead and bets $15, and I call, and the under the gun player also calls. So the turn comes the king of diamonds. Under the gun checks, hijack checks, and I have an option here to either check or bet. I feel like this is where I made a bit of a mistake. I probably should have bet here, because with such strong equity in this hand, I should probably be building up this pot. But I go ahead and I decide to check, and unfortunately, that's where my blunder kind of come in, because the river falls the 4 of clubs. So we go ahead and we make the straight flush, and now the under the gun player checks, and the hijack leads out for $30. So now we've got a decision to make. We've got to figure out what kind of a bet can we make that would get maybe a turned king or maybe a smaller flush to call us with. So I sit and think about it for a while, and I land on a number that I think I could probably get a king or flush draw to call, and I raise it up to $125. The under the gun player folds, and the hijack player thinks about it for a second before asking me if an 8 is any good, and then mucking his cards. I got to flip it over and show him, no, the 8 probably wasn't very good, as I turn over the ace-5 suited, and we take down a decent-sized pot. Alrighty, guys, so looking in here, we've been playing for about 5 hours or so, and we're getting down to our last hand of the night. We're sitting now under the gun, and we look down at ace-jack offsuit. I go ahead and limp, and I'm limping, expecting to call a small raise, probably from someone in late position at the table. And that's exactly what happens. The button raises up to $20, the small blind calls, and I call as well. And we head off to a flop of Ace, Jack, 10, Rainbow. Small blind checks, I go ahead and check, and then the button leads out for $20. Seems like a pretty trivial call here for me. I don't think I want to raise because the last thing I want is to get jammed on and have to make a decision about whether or not my opponent might have king, queen here. So I call, small blind calls, and we go off to a turn, which is the 4 of diamonds. Small blind checks, and I check to the button, who's been the aggressor this whole time, and now the button goes ahead and checks. So action checks around, and we head off to a river, which is the 5 of diamonds. Well, no more straight cards got in there, and there's no flush draw on the board. So I'm figuring our 2 pair is probably going to be pretty good. So I go ahead and I bet $75. The button goes into the tank for a little while, but ultimately decides on a fold, and then the small blind folds as well, and we take down the last hand of the night. All right, guys, that's going to wrap it up for this one. I'm going to stick the results up right over here for the Bankroll Challenge, and we're doing pretty good. We are up a little over $500 in just a couple of sessions, so not bad for being on that 1-2 grind. Let's see, a couple of quick things. I'm going to be in Vegas for the World Series of Poker this summer. I'm going to be out there June 8th to the 13th. Going to fire at a couple of tournaments. Going to probably play the Gladiator, maybe some of the dailies. And I think the big announcement I'm going to lean into a little bit is I'm going to take a shot. So I'm going to be going to play some 2-5, maybe even some 5-10, see what we can make happen. Appreciate you guys for watching the video. If you made it this far, please give us a like and subscribe. It's really helping us grow this channel out. And hope to see you guys there on the next one. Peace.